Welcome to another personal pondering in a psalm. Today's psalm is Psalm 60. This is the last of the psalms with a specific historical context from the life of David. We've seen a number of these in recent studies, mainly set during the time of David's being on the run from Saul and facing other dangers, though this one is at a time when David is actually king. But it's a very interesting historical situation. The story here, by the way, is recorded for us in 2 Samuel 8 and 2 Chronicles 18. What's interesting is those historical narratives give us no hint or mention of defeat or any other disaster overtaking David. It's time of great success as he fights against the Philistines and much farther north against the Arameans, who are mentioned here, including King Zobah. But what this psalm tells us is that at that time David was also under great threat from the Edomites, who are south of Israel. So what seems to have happened is this: as David is winning great victories away up in the north, far north of Israel itself, Edom decides to take the opportunity to attack Jerusalem and the nation from the south. And so David sends Joab, his military commander, and some forces down to fight them, as the introduction mentions, in the Valley of Salt. And there they inflict a great crushing defeat against the Edomites, from which they never recover. So this psalm gives a great illustration of the fact that even when we're winning victories in our spiritual lives and in our walk with the Lord, we constantly have to be on our guard with, as it were, rear guard defenses against the enemy, because he never lets up against us. It's the old principle of the sword and the trowel that Nehemiah instigated when he was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. He ordered the men not only build with a trowel, but have a sword in their hand at the same time. And that's what the Christian life is like. It's a constant holding those two things in tension, making progress, winning victories, but all the time being ready to fight those battles that come around the corner at every opportunity. And even in the midst of victories, we're just a moment away from defeat if we let our guard down. So that's the background to Psalm 60. I've divided up into 3 sections. First of all, verses 1 to 5, God's protection is withdrawn. Look at the graphic image of the fear that's paralyzing the people as they contemplate the threat from the Edomites. Verse 2, it's like an earthquake. The very foundations have been shaken. Verse 3, it's like the effect of wine. The people are reeling and staggering because they're so afraid of the effect of the threat from the Edomites. But what's even worse is in verse 1, the reason for this, the cause is that God has withdrawn his protection. You have rejected us. You have been angry with us. No, we don't know the specific cause here. We don't need to. But God is displeased with his people, and so he has withdrawn his hand of protection and blessing. That's a terrible place to be in. But God, here's the cure for that. Verses 4 and 5. If you return to the Lord, return as it were to the banner that he has set up. For us, that's the cross. It's the victory sign of salvation. If we return back to God, then we will know his blessing again. There's a way back to God from the dark paths of sin. There's a door that is open, and we must go in. That applies to believers as well as to unbelievers. So God's protection is withdrawn. And that's a terrible place to be. Look at verse 10. Have you not rejected us, O God? You do not go forth, O God, with our armies. As Moses prayed in the Old Testament, if you do not go with us, don't send us up from here. We daren't go without the Lord's protection. So 1 to 5, God's protection is withdrawn. Verses 6 to 8, God's promises still stand. Our disobedience cannot prevent God carrying out his purposes and fulfilling his promises. And the list of nations and peoples here that God had promised he would subdue and give their territory to his people. And all these nations are mentioned here as a reminder that God's promises still stand. And then verses 9 to 12, God's presence is vital. We've seen that already from the negative side. Verses 1 to 5, God's protection is withdrawn. But 9 to 12 reminds us that with God, we shall do valiantly. Friends, this is a wonderful psalm that reminds us not just of the spiritual lessons I highlighted at the beginning, but of the fact that although God has promised he will never abandon us and never forsake us, yet there are times in our lives when, of necessity, he withdraws the sense of his presence and his protecting hand from us, and he gives us up even momentarily, to our sinful choices, so we may realize our poverty and our need. Join me again next time as we take another look at another psalm. The Lord bless you.